He decided we have to fight now, and he got into a typical Donald Trump posture where he's ready to be combative on something that he believes is an injustice. This was a personal resolution for a personal matter that would have been made irrespective of the campaign. So with those facts together, there is no crime. President Trump will not take a plea deal in this case. It's not going to happen.
That's one of Donald Trump's attorneys, Joe Tacopina, already setting the tone for Trump's legal defense ahead of Tuesday's arraignment right here in New York. The latest reports are that Trump faces more than 30 counts relating to the hush money payment made to adult film star Stormy Daniels, but the exact charges are unknown as the indictment remains sealed. And so far, as expected, the former president has already railed at Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, denying any wrongdoing and claiming the indictment is purely, quote, political. Joining me now is Charles Coleman Jr., MSNBC legal analyst, former Brooklyn prosecutor, and the host of the Charles Coleman podcast. Charles, my friend, straight out of the gate, I have to ask you, this is a sealed indictment. Arraignment is on Tuesday. What are the chances of any of us, public, including Donald Trump, being able to see what the charges are prior to Tuesday?
I don't think that the public will have much access to this, Katie. I think that Alvin Bragg is going to proceed with this case with every I dotted and every T crossed. And so any leaks that we can expect to come from his office probably are not going to tell us much, if anything. It's very possible that his attorneys might learn a little bit about the indictment before it's unsealed. But in terms of the public and the media, I expect that we will find out with everyone else once that indictment actually comes down and Donald Trump is arraigned.
Charles, let's talk about fairness, because I know some people on the other side that maybe are supporting Donald Trump are going to be complaining about a lack of fairness. This is typical, though, right? It's not like they're treating Donald Trump differently by not, quote, allowing him to see what is in the indictment before his arraignment on Tuesday.
That is correct. Katie, it's important that viewers understand that right now we're talking about citizen Trump. We're not talking about the former president. We're not talking about someone who held office as the 45th president of the United States of America. Donald Trump is being treated like a normal citizen in the state of New York and in the county of Manhattan, where Alvin Bragg is the district attorney and chief law enforcement officer. Because of that, he is not receiving any sort of special provisions or extra special treatment given his previous status as president. This is what would normally happen. The indictment would normally be sealed before it's filed by the DA and then ultimately unsealed at the point of arraignment, and where he will have an opportunity, along with the rest of the world, to learn what these charges actually are.
So Trump is claiming the Justice Department has been weaponized and is politically motivated, putting aside the hypocrisy, because we all saw what the DOJ was like under Attorney General Barr. Look, I tweeted out that witch hunt and George Soros, those are not recognized legal defenses. But can selective prosecution be an argument for Donald Trump as grounds to dismiss an indictment in the state of New York?
Actually, they can't be here, Katie. And the reason why is Alvin Bragg's office has a history of prosecuting people for falsified bookkeeping in their records. They have over 100 cases on record where they have tried people for the same very thing that he is expected to be tried on or expected to be prosecuted on in this case. And so Alvin Bragg is sticking to the rule book in terms of how he has gone about prosecuting cases of this nature in the past. This is not a new charge. This is not their first rodeo for this office. This is something that is standard and routine for them to go after. And so in terms of selective prosecution, it simply just is not here. So I understand that the arguments from the other side may be that this is something that Alvin Bragg is doing as a personal vendetta, but that could not be further from the truth. And the proof is in the record, because there are so many different cases that this DA's office has already prosecuted in the same vein.
Charles, Trump's attorney, Joe Tacopina, saying he doesn't know the nature of the charges, as none of us do at this point, against his client, Donald Trump, or how many counts there are. But he says if the number of counts are correct, which is around 34, it means they've taken each transaction, each check, each payment, each entry, and made a separate charge. As a former prosecutor, we used to do that down in Florida. Do you think that that's what we're going to see from this unsealed indictment come Tuesday?
Well, Katie, I think that that's going to be part of the indictment, and I do expect that that's why the number of counts on the indictment is so high. However, I do expect that there will be some additional information given from the indictment that's going to take that misdemeanor to the felony, and I think that's where the meat of what this indictment has is going to actually come into play. I absolutely do believe that each and every one of those transactions to Michael Cohen is one of the counts on the indictment, but there's going to be more, I suspect, once this indictment is revealed, and that's what's going to be the focus as everything comes out.
As we know, earlier in this month of March, well, actually now we're in April, earlier in March, Trump was invited to testify before the grand jury. We know he declined, and instead he sent Robert Costello for his defense. Could the fact that Trump failed to take up that offer to testify ever be used against him in the New York DA's prosecution?
No, Katie, as you and I both know, a defendant has the right to silence and the Fifth Amendment right to not basically self-incriminate. And I think that it's important to understand for all the viewers out there, Donald Trump, as citizen Trump, is entitled to a fair trial in front of a jury of his peers, and he has every constitutional right and protection that any of us would have if we were in the same situation. Accordingly, DAs would not be able to use the fact that he did not choose to testify against him. That would absolutely be grounds for a mistrial or grounds for an appeal. And so I expect that Alvin Bragg and his assistants will stay very far away from that fact. It's already well known and from the public. They will draw whatever inferences despite whatever instructions they are given from the judge. But it's not something that you will see prosecutors touch because we are well aware that he has a Fifth Amendment right to protect himself against self-incrimination.
You know, Charles, Donald Trump, one of his strategies is always to kind of launch the ad hominem attacks against whomever that he wants to put in the crosshairs. We already know that he's going after the judge in this case who's been assigned to his case. This is Judge Merchan, who was ruling and presiding over the Trump Organization's criminal trial last year. What type of impact do those ad hominem attacks against somebody like the judge in his own case have on Trump's criminal prosecution?
Well, Katie, we've seen Donald Trump do what he can to try to control the narrative in the court of public opinion. But in the court of law, it's not going to have much of an effect. What I am watching for is whether the judge is inclined at some point, maybe not now, but if he continues along this path, to issue some level of a gag order around Donald Trump in social media. It will be interesting to see if that gag order is ever entered and what the contours of them might be. But I think before we get there, it's going to have to be a matter of assessing what the impact is in terms of the public and its response. If there is anything that puts either Alvin Bragg, any of his assistants, or the judge himself in imminent danger or in danger at all, I think that that's when we may enter into a conversation around a gag order or potential gag order from the judge against Donald Trump.
You know, and quickly, I got less than a minute, Charles. I want to stay on that for just a second. I have a concern about the safety of the grand jurors themselves. These were 23 citizens from New York that were told, and they agreed, and they showed up, and they served, and they did it for a long time to be able to render and return a true bill against Donald Trump. The fact that we've moved now to the indictment stage and they no longer need the grand jurors, would that still factor in, do you think, in Judge Merchan's consideration for that gag order if Donald Trump were to start to target those grand jurors?
I think it absolutely would. I also think that that's something that Alvin Bragg's office is going to be watching very carefully. At the end of the day, the grand jury is an essential component in terms of enforcing the law in any jurisdiction. And so Alvin Bragg has to be particularly concerned about whether the identities of these grand jurors would ever be leaked. And of course, what type of situation that puts them in safety-wise. And he's going to be right on top of that.